Yeah. You ain't see me activated. You better hope that you never see me agitated. I think about my
Hello, welcome back. So last time we talked about going into the editor and pulling up your first little bit of basic code onto the web and kind of looking at that document on the web as a web page. And we just did some basics there and kind of jumped into an introduction of the editor. And so, obviously I want you to ignore this bottom part down here. Anything past this little mark is just what's called a comment, which I will show you here in a little bit. But for now, just kind of ignore all this content down here and only kind of pay attention to what we're doing right up here with this kind of content. But that said, I want to go ahead and jump into what makes up an element. So what is an element and what does it have to do with HTML? Well, it is the building block for HTML. It's the main thing that you use to structure a page. And so what makes up an element is an opening and closing tag. So this is an opening tag, this is a closing tag. And what makes an opening tag? You have a less than sign or symbol and a greater than sign or symbol, and the less than sign or symbol is the opening, what I'm going to refer to as opening angle bracket, and the greater than sign I'm going to refer to as a closing angle bracket. And the reason I'm going to use that kind of terminology is because we're going to deal with a lot of opening and closing parentheses, single quotes, double quotes, curly braces, square brackets, all that kind of stuff. So it just kind of falls in line with that kind of language. So I'm going to use that type of language throughout this course. And then, so we have an opening angle bracket and a closing angle bracket. And then in between the opening angle bracket and closing angle bracket, we have our tag name. Now you'll notice this little slash here, which is what the difference between an opening tag and a closing tag is. So this whole set here, we have the opening angle bracket, closing angle bracket, and the tag name, which is the opening tag. And the only difference between the opening and closing tag is the forward slash. And I used to be confused about forward and backward slash. If you are, just draw a head. Imagine there's a head up on the top. Is it leaning forward or is it leaning backward? And so I don't know if that helps you, but it definitely helped me reading from left to right speaking. So in any case, the entirety of everything that you see in between the opening tag, the closing tag, including both of those things in between those, is called an element. That is the full element. And then you have the content, which is the stuff in the middle in between the opening and closing tag. And then sometimes you do have what's called a self-closing element. And so the entirety of the element is contained within itself. The opening tag, so you'll have the opening angle bracket, and the closing angle bracket is way back here. And in between, you have what are called attributes. So we'll go into attributes in the near future. Matter of fact, we might even get to them in this video. But, as a matter of fact, let me enlarge this for you. Okay. So these attributes in squares here, the content in the middle, the opening and closing tag, you can see all that stuff a little bit better. But in this self-closing element, you have opening angle bracket, closing angle bracket, and there's no necessarily closing tag. So it's all within the opening tag. All the content that you need for what you need for that particular thing is within that tag. And so what we do is we put a little forward slash at the end just before the closing angle bracket for that opening tag. And that signifies that this is a self-closing element. You don't necessarily have to do it, but really you can and you should, in my opinion. It's just good habit. And then it'll matter later in React. I think React also wants it later on. So it's just good practice just to make it a habit now. So let's go on. I believe that was it in that. Next thing we'll go ahead and move on to in this video. We're good on time here. basic HTML structure. We kind of went over that in the last video. We had the doc type HTML, we had the HTML tag, we had the head and the body inside of that, and inside the head you have the meta tags and title, and inside the body would have things like the paragraph and the H1, things like that, things of that nature, which we kind of went through in that last video, but the basic structure was there, and that's what this is. So the HTML5 declaration for the browser to build the actual document, need to notify that it's HTML5. This is not case sensitive, and we will not deal with other types of HTML, but HTML5, there's a 4, 3, 2, 1, whatever. We won't kind of go into that kind of legacy declaration, so this is just the one that you need moving forward until further notice. HTML, unless you want to get into this yourself, by the way, and of course you can always backtrack, but HTML is the root element, and it's parent to the head and body, meaning it contains the body and head tags, and so the head contains metadata, which is data about the document data, not user visible. So except for that little tab that you might see, we put a little title in there, and that shows up in favorites and search results as well, when you favorite something, and when there's somebody searching out the page, this kind of gives the information that people would see in those circumstances. But aside from that, you're really not going to see things from the head go on to the actual body of the page of the web page that you create. That's all contained in the body, which is when you build a paragraph or a heading or any amount of elements that are contained within the body. That's when it's going to start to be visible to the user. Aside from that, the meta defines the character set. In this case, this is something that would go inside the head, and we will get more in detail on that, so I'm not going to kind of beat this one up too much on that conversation, but I will go quickly over here and say inside the head, this defines things such as language, character set, styles, scripts, and title, and we will go into each of these things. And the meta can do things like character set, page description, keywords, document author, keywords for search engines, viewport settings, things of that nature. Inside the body, that includes but not limited to things like paragraph, headings, listings, navigation bars, links, buttons, headers and footers, images, and a lot more, including CSS styling. So that is pretty well covered, and we're still reasonable on time, so I'm just going to jump right into attributes because that shouldn't take terribly long here. So with the attributes, you have source, alt, height, width in this case, and if we went back a couple here, they're the same things inside of this image self-closing tag that are outlined in red here. Now, each attribute provides information about the element, and it's always inside the opening tag just before the closing angle bracket. So you'll notice whether it's a self-closing element or if you have the opening and closing tag like this paragraph, you'll still notice that the closing angle bracket of the opening tag is really what is containing those attributes. And then many attributes are out there, like 100, over 100. And each one affects a specific set of elements. So what works on one particular type of element may not work on others. And I'll walk through a few examples here. So source, for example, it goes on a lot of different elements, but it's just the URL of media. So it gives you kind of the source of where the media is coming from that you want to use in that particular image or in that particular element type. So in this case, it is an image, and we're finding the image URL. We're defining that within the source. And then alt is only this particular attribute is only really found in the image, input, and area, and it's for accessibility purposes. So we say my image. You would really type out a full description of what the image is or what the media is, and by doing that, then you would allow somebody who is perhaps hard of seeing, partially blind or fully blind, and they have to listen to the audio accessibility settings, then this would give a better description. And if there wasn't a good description, then it would leave them kind of wondering, like, okay, well, what's the image? I can't see it, so I'm left out in the dark, and it makes it less accessible for that type of user. And so it's just something, and it's also mandatory in some of the things like image. You have to have alternative text. Then you have things like the height and width. A lot of different elements use these. Kind of defines the height and width. It's pretty self-explanatory. So we'll get into playing around with some of that stuff when we get into more of CSS. So I won't dig into that very much. But then you have the style and the language tags. So the style tag defines CSS inline as an attribute tag. And we're actually going to jump into CSS, so I'm not going to go too deep into this, but basically it allows us to change things like the color of the text, the font size, the background color to something, so we'd have like a background of beige and a color of blue, and you can ignore the content for now, but because we're just focused on the attributes here, but that's basically what style is going to do. Just kind of a high level overview of that tag. And that is global, meaning it's going to be able to go on to any attribute, or any element rather. And language is the same thing. We can define the content language. So in the HTML, we define the content of that HTML as English, but we can put that language tag on any or that language attribute on any element, and it will define the content language for that element. And then you have things like this meta tag, you have charset here as an example, as an attribute, and those only go on meta and script type of elements. For character encoding, UTF-8, for example, is one of the character sets, and we will get into that as well later on down the road. Then the last thing to note here before we sign off is that some are required, some are optional, some are standard, and some are event-driven attributes. And so that you have like an on-click demand that, on the click we recognize and then something happens. And that's an event attribute. A standard one is just one you can put on anything that you would like this language tag. And then you have optional ones where, maybe it's recommended that you put it on, and maybe there's a default for it if you don't, but it's optional if you want to kind of change that setting. And then, the required ones that are just flat out required, like that alt tag for the image and the input and area tags and things of that nature. So that's kind of attributes in a nutshell, something that we're going to be using throughout the course. Not a tremendous amount of. We're going to focus more on the CSS of things, which is this style tag here. And, there's definite uses for attributes, so maybe I'll back off the statement that we won't use them a lot, but certainly not something I found myself digging so deeply into as I used HTML, but especially because I moved on to use those faster tools like React and some of those other frameworks and libraries and things of that nature. So that's it for this one. I will catch you guys in the next one. See ya.